prior to the coronavirus, it was just all go. The numbers were fantastic, and we don't even know what the numbers are now. We'll have to see. The numbers from a week ago were great, and from 2 days ago were great, but now we're hitting a patch, and we're going to have to do something with respect to getting rid of this virus as quickly as possible and as safely as possible. Our number one priority is the health of the people of our country, and so we'll be making most likely a statement. I'll be making a statement later on tonight as to what I've decided to do and what our country will be doing. Charlie, please.
President, the only thing I would add to what Brian and Mike said is, first of all, reiterate that we are all here to help. That is what our institutions do. We're all in a position to do it, and I think we're being very, very thoughtful about how we can do that for both consumers, small businesses, as well as the companies that we deal with. I think we're all encouraging any of our customers or clients who are having any issues to make sure that they talk to us. We're all developing programs to ensure that as they and the employees and their customers go through this situation, that we're there to be a source of strength, whether it's to help them through issues with their fees, payments, or to be there to lend. That's what we do.
I'm glad you're saying that. That's great, because there may be some of that, frankly, more so than you've been used to for the last 3 years, right? It could happen. David?
I appreciate it, Mr. President. I'm glad to be here with my colleagues that run these other institutions. Most of what I would say would echo what's been said. The banking system is in good shape. The virus obviously poses a unique challenge both for policymakers and for businesses, large and small, operating across the country. All businesses are very, very focused on their people and taking care of their people. As part of the banking system, we're looking to help businesses, large, small, individuals, any way we can, and are making the same steps and taking the same steps that these other institutions have spoken about. And so we'll get through this, but it's going to require some navigation on the part of all of us, and we're focused on doing our part.
You're doing very well. And we'll be doing a lot of additional work with small business, as you know. We're going to be adding many billions of dollars, and we're going to be making lots of small business loans, as the banks are too. So it will be. Do you have anything to say about that?
Yes, of course. But first, I'd like to thank you, Mr. President, for being so aggressive and very specific about protecting the health and safety of our employees. And I'm very encouraged by the leaders in this industry that are thinking along the same lines about their employees and their community. But I'd like to point out that SBA has the authority currently with $18 billion to provide loans with the support of all the lenders in this room. And they also have the opportunity to extend some of the payment terms up to 6 months. So I'm looking forward to working with every one of them to leave no money on the table on those $18 billion so we can provide support for the small businesses.
Yesterday, as you know, we met with the insurance companies, the top companies, the top people in the top companies, like yourselves, and they were very generous. And you know what they did with co-pays and everything else. They're going all out. So we appreciated that very much.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.